Welcome back to Mythos and Murder Manor. Tonight, we unravel the story behind the biggest crime of the American century. He was the greatest hero of his age, the aviator who crossed an ocean and united a world. She was his infant son, sleeping safe in his crib. But in the dead of a cold March night, Charles Lindbergh's perfect American life became the scene of the crime of the century. A homemade ladder, a ransom note, a desperate search, and a trial that captivated the globe. For nearly 100 years, the world believed this case was case closed. But what if the greatest manhunt in history led to the wrong guy, and the most notorious kidnapping of all time is still an unsolved murder? That's the real kicker. To wrap your head around this whole mess, you first have to remember who Charles Lindbergh was back then. In 1927, Lindbergh wasn't just famous, he was a big deal. He flew solo across the Atlantic in the spirit of St. Louis, and overnight he became the kind of hero that only comes along once in a generation, a real American idol. He was handsome, quiet, and a symbol of that can-do attitude we loved. But that kind of fame, it was a nightmare. It followed him like a shadow. That's why he and his wife, Anne Morrow Lindbergh, did what any sensible couple would do. They got the heck out of town. They built a remote estate up in Hopewell, New Jersey. It was more like a fortress than a home, high up on a hill, surrounded by woods, far from the nearest road. The house was still under construction, a work in progress, but it was their sanctuary. The one place their baby boy, Charles Jr., could grow up without 1,000 flashbulbs going off in his face. It was totally isolated, which, ironically, made it the easiest target in the world. The date was March 1st, 1932, a Tuesday. Everything seemed right as rain. Charles Sr. and Anne were inside with their 20-month-old son, the nurse Betty Gow, and a few other staff. The baby was tucked in early in his second-floor nursery. The Lindberghs weren't supposed to be there that night, which is one of those freaky little details you can't shake. They were only there because of a slight change in plans. Around 9:30 p.m., Colonel Lindbergh was down in his library, probably working late. He heard a noise, a loud, short crack. He thought it sounded like a slat on an apple crate giving way. Now, in the silence of those dark woods, that should have sent up a red flag, but he just brushed it off. Thought the house was settling. Big mistake. A devastating human mistake. The staff went to bed, and the house fell quiet. Sometime later, the baby's nurse, Betty Gow, went to check on the little guy before turning in herself. She opened the door, and her blood probably ran ice cold. The crib was empty. The blanket was tossed aside, and near the window, sitting innocently on the sill, was a sealed envelope. Betty let out a scream that brought the whole house running. The crib was searched again, the room was ripped apart, and the terrible truth hit them like a ton of bricks. The child was gone. Charles Lindbergh, the man who flew through the clouds, was totally at sea down on Earth. He grabbed his rifle and rushed outside, circling the house in the dark, frantic. That's when they found the first piece of the puzzle. Leaning against the house, right beneath the nursery window, was a homemade 3-section wooden ladder. It was crudely slapped together, and it was broken near the bottom. That loud crack Lindbergh had heard an hour earlier, that was the ladder snapping under the weight of the kidnapper, and maybe the child. The nursery window itself was open, and the screen was sliced right down the middle. Lindbergh opened the note, and just like that, the private tragedy was national news. It was a sloppily written, grammatically rough note demanding $50,000. And here's the kicker. It was signed with a bizarre interlocking double ring symbol with 3 holes punched between them, a crude but clear signature. Without even taking a breath, Lindbergh made the first decision that would mess up the investigation. He called the local police. In an instant, the case was swamped by local yokels, state troopers, politics, and a media frenzy the likes of which America had never seen. That fortress they built for privacy, it was breached. The Lindbergh baby was gone, and the country was about to lose its collective mind. The moment Lindbergh hung up the phone with the local New Jersey authorities, the case went haywire. It was a local police matter for about 5 seconds before the press and the entire country came crashing in. The celebrity factor here was absolutely out of control. The kidnapping of the son of America's greatest hero was catnip for the media. Within hours, the road to the Hopewell estate was jammed with reporters, photographers, and every Tom, Dick, and Harry who thought they had a clue, or worse, who just wanted to gawk. This was the 1930s, folks. Forensics were rudimentary, and law enforcement wasn't coordinated nationally like the FBI is today. New Jersey was scrambling, but J. Edgar Hoover's FBI was limited. Kidnapping wasn't a federal crime unless the victim was taken across state lines, meaning the Bureau could only assist the state police. The result was a hot mess. Police, private detectives, and reporters all tripping over each other, contaminating the crime scene and feeding the media frenzy. It's a shame, really, because if there was ever a case that needed a cool head and sealed evidence, this was it. The pressure on Lindbergh was immense. He wasn't just dealing with police, he was dealing with the world. He was desperate, so he went outside the law. First, he issued a public plea for the kidnapper to contact him. Then, he got offers of help from the most unlikely places, including notorious mob bosses like Al Capone, who offered his services from his prison cell. Lindbergh, being the stubborn guy he was, rejected the mobsters, but accepted the help of a retired Bronx schoolteacher named Dr. John F. Condon. This guy was a real character, an eccentric, quirky old man who ran an ad in the newspaper under the pseudonym Japsy, a corruption of JFC, offering a reward to the kidnapper. And the kidnapper, using that strange interlocking double ring symbol as his signature, actually took the bait. Japsy began a correspondence with the man he called Cemetery John. These negotiations were straight out of a B-movie, tense, confusing, and full of high-stakes paranoia. Lindbergh put his full faith in this oddball teacher, handing over the reins to his son's fate. The payoff was finally arranged for the night of April 2nd, 1932, a little over a month after the kidnapping. Japsy went alone to St. Raymond's Cemetery in the Bronx, carrying the $50,000 ransom, which consisted mainly of gold certificates. This detail is crucial. The gold notes were unique and traceable. Before handing them over, the numbers of all the bills were meticulously recorded, a real stroke of genius that would later crack the case wide open. Condon met a shadowy man who spoke with a distinct German accent, a voice Japsy would never forget. The man accepted the money and, in exchange, handed over a crude note claiming the child was safe aboard a boat called the Nellie, anchored off the coast of Martha's Vineyard. Lindbergh was immediately mobilized. He raced to the coast, charting a plane, searching tirelessly for a boat that, as we now know, did not exist. It was a total setup. The kidnapper had the money, and Lindbergh had nothing left but a bad case of the blues and a false, desperate hope. For the next 72 days, the Lindbergh family and the entire nation lived in a state of suspended agony. The ransom money was gone, the search for the Nellie was a bust, and the world held its breath, waiting for a miracle. Then, on May 12, 1932, the horror story reached its final, tragic conclusion. A truck driver named William Allen stopped alongside a lonely stretch of road just 4.5 miles from the Lindbergh estate. He stepped into the woods to relieve himself and stumbled upon something truly sickening. Lying in a shallow grave, barely covered by dirt and leaves, were the remains of a small child. The clothes were decayed, but the nurse, Betty Gow, was able to identify the handmade shirt. It was little Charlie. The medical examination confirmed what Lindbergh already feared. The baby had died quickly from a massive blow to the head. This changed everything. This wasn't a kidnapping that went wrong. This was a cold-blooded murder disguised as a ransom plot. The popular theory that took hold: the child was likely killed the moment the ladder broke. That very cracking sound Lindbergh dismissed was the sound of the crime being completed. The kidnapper panicked, buried the body nearby, and then continued the ransom plot as a pure cash grab. The discovery was a kick in the gut for America. The hope was gone, replaced by a profound national grief and a burning, absolute demand for justice. The focus of the investigation instantly shifted from rescue to revenge. The only clues left were the cheap wood of the ladder, the handwriting on the ransom notes, and those $50,000 in traceable gold certificates. It was a long shot, but it was all they had left. The entire investigation was now a desperate race to connect the most mundane objects: wood, paper, and cash. The ladder itself was a real Frankenstein job, crudely constructed from 3 sections designed to nest together. It looked like it was built in a hurry by someone who wasn't exactly a master carpenter. The cops initially looked at it as a means to an end, a way to get the kid. But Charles Lindbergh, the methodical flyer, saw it differently. He immediately had it scrutinized. That was the smart play, because this homemade staircase held the smoking gun. Investigators immediately realized the builder was an amateur, but had a clear method. The wood wasn't all new. Some pieces looked like salvaged lumber. The nails were mismatched. But the most important part? A renowned wood specialist named Arthur Kohler from the U.S. Forest Service was brought in. And let me tell you, this guy was the real MVP of the investigation. Kohler went over every single piece of that ladder with a fine-tooth comb. He found a handful of details that were like fingerprints in wood grain. First, he noticed distinctive mill marks, the specific pattern left by the planer blades at the lumber mill. These marks were unique enough to narrow down where the wood came from, but that's just the start. The truly wild part was when Kohler started looking at a single critical piece of wood known as rail 16. This piece was a sidebar on one of the sections. Kohler discovered that the grain pattern, the knots, and the nail holes on rail 16 exactly matched the dimensions and grain of wood from a different part of the ladder, as if they were cut from the same larger board. This meant the builder had started with a single plank, cut out a piece for rail 16, and then used the next sequential piece of the plank somewhere else on the ladder. But wait, there's more. Kohler found that rail 16 had been damaged or removed from its original intended use. He determined that the wood used for rail 16 had originally been a floor joist from an attic. The joist had been planed on only one side, and on the unplaned side there were traces of sanding dust and plaster dust, tiny forensic clues that pointed to its former life in a home. This was a game changer. It meant the kidnapper didn't buy the wood from a lumber yard right before the crime. They used a very specific piece of wood, stolen or salvaged from somewhere else. A plank with a clear, traceable manufacturing pedigree, and one that had been repurposed from inside a house. The goal now became not just finding the person, but finding the source of that wood. Simultaneously, the notes themselves were under the microscope. All 13 of the ransom notes, from the one found in the nursery to the one handed to Jaffe at the payoff, were examined by handwriting experts. The notes contained clumsy grammar, bizarre vocabulary, and consistent misspellings, like writing money as money and board as boat. Remember the non-existent Nellie? This consistent pattern was a handwriting blueprint that was unique to the author. The experts were confident they could ID the person the minute they saw another sample of their writing. For over 2 years, the trail went cold as ice. The police knew what they were looking for. A man, based on the labor involved in carrying the ladder and the child, with a German accent based on Jaffe's testimony, who was a clumsy carpenter and who knew the Lindbergh estate's secluded location. But without a new lead, the case stalled. The fame that had brought so much attention to the crime now threatened to bury it in old newspaper. Then, thanks to one of the sharpest decisions of the entire investigation, the meticulous recording of the serial numbers on the gold certificates, the dead end finally gave way. The mundane nature of those unique gold notes was about to prove more powerful than any eyewitness. The entire nation was waiting for a break, and that break would come not with a roar, but with the quiet, gradual circulation of cold, hard cash. They had the blueprint of the crime. They just needed the person cashing the checks. The whole story was about to turn on a single fateful transaction at a gas pump. For more than 2.5 years after the ransom drop, the Lindbergh case went dead quiet. The press got bored, the public attention drifted to the Great Depression, and the police were chasing ghosts. The $50,000 in ransom money, mostly old-style gold certificates, had vanished into the economic black hole of the 1930s. Remember, these notes were unique. Before they were handed to Jaffe, the serial number of every single bill was recorded. This was the only silver bullet the investigation had. The problem? Back in 1933, President Roosevelt issued an executive order recalling all gold certificates to shore up the national banking system. This meant anyone holding the ransom money had to exchange it for new currency, but most people ignored the order. The marked bills, however, couldn't be spent easily because they were so distinctive. They were like hot potatoes, too risky for a bank, but too valuable to throw away. The police and the FBI, who finally got a proper role after the Lindbergh Law made kidnapping a federal crime, launched a massive national awareness campaign. They put the serial numbers on posters, sent them to banks, and circulated them to businesses. They were playing the long game, banking on the fact that eventually desperation or carelessness would force the kidnapper to pass one of the notes. The big break finally came on September 15th, 1934, and it was one of the most bone-headed moves in criminal history. It was late in the afternoon at a gas station run by Walter Lyle in Upper Manhattan, New York City. A dark green sedan pulled up. The driver asked for 5 gallons of gas, costing 98 cents. When it came time to pay, the driver handed Lyle a $10 gold certificate. Lyle hesitated. These notes were rare now. He asked the driver where he got it. The driver, speaking with a noticeable German accent, claimed he'd been given it by a friend. Lyle, being a meticulous type, wrote the license plate number of the sedan, 4U1341, right on the bill before accepting it. It was a seemingly mundane transaction, a quick pit stop, but it would send a jolt of electricity through the entire investigation. Lyle later turned the bill over to the authorities. The serial number matched the list. Within hours, the police had the license plate tracked to an apartment building in the Bronx. They set up a surveillance stakeout, waiting for the owner of the sedan to appear. That owner was a German immigrant named Bruno Richard Hauptmann. When Hauptmann was finally spotted and pulled over, the arrest itself was pure drama. The police found a $20 gold certificate from the ransom tucked into his wallet. Hauptmann panicked, protesting his innocence, but the police weren't buying it. He was taken into custody, and the investigation kicked into overdrive. The police then searched Hauptmann's tiny garage behind his apartment. Hidden inside a compartment of the garage was the definitive proof. A shoebox full of more gold certificates, wrapped in rags. The amount recovered was over $14,000 of the original ransom money. Hauptmann's explanation was weak, claiming the money belonged to a deceased friend named Isidor Fish, who had left it with him before returning to Germany. Fish, Hauptmann claimed, was the real culprit, and he was simply holding the cash. It was a cockamamie story, but it was his defense. Now the police had the money and the man with the German accent. But the real nail in the coffin came when they looked at Hauptmann's attic. They found where the garage compartment had been constructed. And guess what? In the rafters of that attic, they found the piece of wood missing from the makeshift cabinet. This piece of wood was then taken to Arthur Kohler. Kohler took the wood from the attic and the infamous rail 16 from the ladder. Using his meticulous methods, he performed a perfect match. He demonstrated beyond any reasonable doubt that the wood used to build the ladder that had stood under the nursery window, had been pulled directly from the flooring joists of Bruno Hauptmann's own attic. The grain matched, the knot matched, and the mill marks all lined up. The investigation wasn't just about money anymore. It was about the forensic geometry of a piece of wood. The gold certificates linked the man to the money. The wood linked the man to the crime scene. For the police and the public, the case was over. They had their man, and they were ready to put him in the electric chair. When the police dragged Bruno Richard Hauptmann out of his sedan on September 19, 1934, the world stopped holding its breath and let out a collective roar of recognition. This was the moment of justice the nation had been waiting for, a payoff that came 2.5 years late, but felt like manna from heaven in the depths of the Depression. The man they arrested was a German carpenter, 35 years old, a legal immigrant who, upon arrival, had gone straight to the Bronx. But here's the real kicker that the public often forgets. Hauptmann was already a criminal. Back in Germany, he'd done time for robbery and had been involved in a couple of minor violent crimes. He was already a shady character, and that history, coupled with his heavy German accent, immediately fueled the media's narrative, the foreign predator who preyed upon America's golden boy. The police were practically gloating. They had the license plate, the marked ransom money in his wallet, and the distinct German accent that matched Jaffsey's description of Cemetery John. But the true victory was that search of his garage. Inside that shoebox, police found $14,600 of the traceable gold certificates. That amount was a huge haul in 1934. Hauptmann's story about the money was the first thing to make everyone's eyebrows rise. He claimed the money belonged to his late business partner, a man named Isidor Fisch, who had left it with Hauptmann before sailing back to Germany, only to die there shortly after. Hauptmann swore that he only recently found the hidden money, and, figuring Fisch owed him cash, he started spending it. The police didn't buy it for a second. The timeline was weak, the story was convenient, and the idea of a dying man leaving a small fortune in cash hidden in a shoebox in a garage was frankly bonkers. But the most damning moment wasn't the money. It was the forensic slam dunk provided by the ladder's wood. When Arthur Kohler, the wood expert, showed the police how the wood from Hauptmann's attic floor joists was the exact match for rail 16 of the kidnapping ladder, it sealed the public's conviction. It wasn't just similar wood, it was the same plank. This wasn't circumstantial. This was physical proof that the kidnapper's tools were made in Hauptmann's own house. The police then decided to press their luck. They brought Hauptmann to an identification lineup. Despite the passage of time and the stress of the event, the eccentric Dr. Condon, Jaffsey, positively identified Hauptmann as Cemetery John, the man he met in the dark of St. Raymond's Cemetery to pay the ransom. Condon's conviction in the courtroom would be electric. However, a dark cloud was already forming over the investigation. The German carpenter was subjected to days of relentless, brutal interrogation, the kind of police work that wouldn't fly today. He was held without sleep, badgered and pressured to confess. The police needed a confession to make the case airtight, but Hauptmann never wavered. He insisted right up until the end that he was guilty of hoarding the ransom money, but absolutely innocent of the kidnapping and murder. He was a thief, maybe, but not a killer. This denial, while the evidence against him mounted, became the crux of the controversy. Why, with the gold notes in his garage, the handwriting analysis, and the ladder wood staring him down, would he refuse to confess? Was he a hardened killer holding on to a lie, or was he a frightened man framed for the final piece of the crime he didn't commit? The local Bronx police, drunk on the capture, didn't handle the evidence with the professionalism the case demanded. They lost crucial pieces of the ladder and allowed the press to trample over potential clues. The pressure to close the crime of the century was so overwhelming that justice was already running a distant second to the show. Hauptmann was shipped off to New Jersey to face trial, immediately setting up the next phase of this colossal American drama. His German wife, Anna Hauptmann, stood by him, maintaining his innocence and sticking to the Fisch story. But the public, the police, and the entire judicial system of New Jersey were already convinced. The carpenter from the Bronx had built the ladder, taken the money, and killed the child. All that remained was the final act, the show trial the world couldn't wait to see. The trial of Bruno Richard Hauptmann, held in the sleepy little town of Flemington, New Jersey, in January 1935, was a three-ring circus. It was dubbed the Trial of the Century, and boy, did it live up to the hype. The public was desperate for a villain, and the press, over 700 journalists from around the world, turned the courthouse square into a madhouse. It was justice by mob rule, where Hauptmann was convicted in the newspapers long before the jury ever got the case. The judge had to use a gavel the size of a cinder block just to keep the reporters from stampeding the courtroom. People fought in the streets for seats, and reporters rented rooms overlooking the courthouse just to get a glimpse of the proceedings. The atmosphere wasn't one of sober legal deliberation. It was a Roman Colosseum waiting for the thumbs down. The prosecution, led by New Jersey Attorney General David Willents, had a rock-solid case built almost entirely on the forensic evidence. They brought out witness after witness, each one hammering home the connection between Hauptmann and the crime. First up was Dr. John F. Condon, Jafsy. The eccentric old man stood on the stand and with absolute certainty pointed to Hauptmann, declaring him to be Cemetery John, the German-accented man he paid the ransom to in the dark cemetery. This was a hugely emotional moment, an eyewitness account that seemed to settle the matter for the public. Then came the forensic heavy hitters. The prosecution brought out their handwriting experts, who testified that Hauptmann's German script was undeniably the same hand that penned all 13 ransom notes, including the bizarre misspellings like money. They argued the consistent errors were unique markers, proving he was the author. But the real showstopper was Arthur Kohler, the quiet, methodical wood expert. Kohler's testimony was pure science, a welcome contrast to the courtroom theatrics. He brought out the ladder pieces and the sawed-off joist from Hauptmann's attic, patiently explaining to the jury how the nail holes, the growth rings, and the unique mill marks all aligned perfectly. The most dramatic moment was when Kohler demonstrated the rail 16 match. He showed the jury that the grain pattern of the ladder piece was the mirror image of the grain pattern on the wood left in Hauptmann's attic, proving they were sequential pieces cut from the same original plank. This was cutting-edge forensic science for the time, and it left the jury absolutely speechless. The prosecution argued convincingly that no other person in the world could have built that ladder. Hauptmann's defense team, led by Edward J. Riley, a lawyer who was allegedly more interested in his fee than his client, was a train wreck. They were unprepared, often erratic, and completely outclassed by the technical nature of the prosecution's case. When Hauptmann finally took the stand, he was his own worst enemy. He maintained the Isidore Fish story, claiming the ransom money was left to him by his deceased friend. He admitted to hoarding the cash, but insisted that he had nothing to do with the kidnapping or the murder. The jury, however, found his denial about the money to be incredibly suspicious and completely illogical. Why would an innocent man possess nearly $15,000 of marked ransom cash? The defense tried to poke holes,
They argued that the handwriting match was subjective and that the wood evidence was circumstantial. The plank could have been stolen. They also suggested Hauptmann was framed, or that he was involved only in blackmail, not murder. They even suggested the possibility of accomplices, claiming the ladder was too flimsy for one man to climb with a heavy child. But none of it could overcome the physical evidence or the emotional weight of the case. Colonel Lindbergh himself took the stand to confirm a minor detail from the night of the ransom drop, a brief utterance from Cemetery John. Lindbergh's mere presence in the courtroom was enough to remind the jury of the nation's grief and his status as a suffering hero. The trial lasted 5 weeks. The judge instructed the jury that if they believed Hauptmann was the man who received the ransom, they must find him guilty of kidnapping and murder. After only 11 hours of deliberation, the verdict was returned. Guilty. The roar from the crowd outside the courthouse was deafening. Justice, the public believed, had been served. Bruno Richard Hauptmann was sentenced to death by electric chair. For America, the crime of the century was finally closed. But as soon as the gavel fell, the whispers of doubt began. The speed and savagery of the trial and the lingering questions left unanswered ensured that the ghost of the Lindbergh baby would continue to haunt the American justice system for decades.
The verdict was guilty. The sentence was death. And for America, the trial of the century was over. But here's the thing about a story that big. It never really ends. The minute the carnival packed up and left Flemington, the controversy started to bubble. And those whispers of doubt the defense tried to raise turned into a steady, deafening noise that echoes even today. Many people, including Hauptmann's wife, Anna, believed that while he may have been a crook who held the ransom money, he was not the killer. Hauptmann spent the next 2 years fighting for his life, filing appeal after appeal. He never once confessed to the kidnapping or the murder of the child. He maintained his defense. The money was left to him by the now-deceased Isidore Fish. He only spent the gold certificates because he thought Fish owed him. The authorities, meanwhile, offered him multiple chances to commute his sentence to life imprisonment if he would simply confess and name his accomplices. Hauptmann refused to the very end, claiming he couldn't name accomplices because there were none, and he was innocent of the main crime. His refusal to confess, even to save his own life, is one of the eerie questions that still sticks in the craw of history buffs. Now, let's talk about the major cracks in the prosecution's seemingly perfect case. If you dig into the details, the whole thing starts to look shaky. First, the police work was a national disgrace. The Hopewell estate was a free-for-all, with hundreds of gawkers and journalists destroying any potential footprints or forensic evidence. The police themselves were accused of coercing witnesses. Key testimony, like the man who claimed to see Hauptmann near the Hopewell estate, was later proven to be unreliable or even outright fabricated. The pressure to close the case was so immense that authorities were seemingly willing to cut corners and push the evidence, even if it meant ignoring leads that pointed elsewhere. Second, the handwriting evidence is now widely considered suspect. At the time, handwriting analysis was seen as an infallible science, but today, experts are much more skeptical about the certainty of the match.
The notes themselves were written in a disguised hand, and Hauptmann's everyday script was different. It raises the question, was the match forced to fit the suspect they already had? Third, and perhaps the most damaging piece of doubt, is the persistent belief that Hauptmann could not have acted alone. The ladder was clumsy and heavy. Climbing it, entering the window, and descending with a heavy, struggling toddler would have been a Herculean, silent task, especially for a man with no history of solo, elaborate kidnappings. This theory suggests that Hauptmann was a fall guy, or at best, a hired hand, used for his carpentry and knowledge of the area. Was Cemetery John just one of several people involved? For years, attention was cast on members of the Lindbergh household staff, including Violet Sharp, a maid who acted erratically during questioning and later took her own life. Though police cleared the family staff, the unresolved questions linger, feeding the conspiracy theories that still circulate. In the end, all Hauptmann's appeals failed. On April 3, 1936, Bruno Richard Hauptmann was executed in the electric chair. His last words were a final affirmation of his innocence in the kidnapping and murder. So, why does this case still matter? The Lindbergh kidnapping was a profound turning point for America. The national trauma and outrage over the crime, and the subsequent legal spectacle, led Congress to pass the Federal Kidnapping Act in 1932, popularly known as the Lindbergh Law. This law finally made kidnapping a federal offense, punishable by death, granting the FBI the jurisdiction they needed to hunt down kidnappers across state lines. It was a direct response to the jurisdictional foul-up that hampered the initial investigation. As for Charles Lindbergh, the man whose fame defined the crime, the trial was the last straw. Exhausted by the scrutiny, mourning his son, and disillusioned with American celebrity, he and Anne packed up their family and permanently moved to Europe shortly after the execution. The man who represented the golden age of American promise had been driven out of the country by the very crime committed against him. The execution of Bruno Richard Hauptmann closed the file for the state of New Jersey, but it never closed the book for the world. To this day, the Lindbergh kidnapping is a dark mirror reflecting a troubled moment in American history. A tragedy where the hunger for a guilty verdict may have tragically superseded the quest for truth. The gold notes were recovered, the ladder was matched, and a man was executed. But the question remains, did the nation sacrifice one man to find closure on the crime of the century? That is the chilling puzzle that continues to haunt the perfect American hero and his lost son.
The official narrative, that a lone German carpenter named Bruno Richard Hauptmann committed the crime, has been fiercely challenged for decades. The very speed and severity of the trial left a feeling of unfinished business, and the conspiracy theories surrounding the case are as compelling as the facts themselves. The public conviction of guilt was immediate, but the feeling that the real story was much more complicated simply never went away. The inside job theory. Who knew the schedule? One of the most persistent theories suggests that the crime was an inside job or involved an accomplice from within the Lindbergh compound. The defense tried to cast suspicion on members of the household staff, particularly the family maid, Violet Sharp. Sharp acted erratically during questioning, gave conflicting alibis, and tragically took her own life shortly after being interrogated. The timing of the kidnapping, on a Tuesday night when the family normally wasn't even at the Hopewell estate, is a huge red flag. The theory argues that an insider, familiar with the home's layout and the family's highly irregular schedule, was necessary to commit the crime with such precise timing. The plot was likely executed by two people, an inside man to grab the baby, and Hauptmann, the carpenter, to provide the tools and handle the ransom. This would explain the difficulty of the climb and the apparent knowledge of the home's intimate schedule. The fragile ladder and the accomplice. Another major doubt circles back to the fragility of the ladder. It was crudely built, heavy, and it broke during the commission of the crime. Many experts have argued that it would have been nearly impossible for a single man to silently climb the shaky, makeshift ladder, enter the window, lift a 20-month-old child, and descend without making significant noise. This difficulty is strong evidence for the accomplice theory, suggesting Hauptmann had to have had someone else on the ground holding the ladder steady or even inside the house. The ladder was a two-person job, further undermining the state's sole perpetrator narrative. The frame-up, Hauptmann as the scapegoat. Perhaps the most potent defense of Hauptmann's innocence is the theory that he was a victim of a frame-up. This theory is often promoted by Hauptmann's descendants and legal advocates. It suggests that police, desperate to close the case, deliberately ignored evidence that pointed away from their chosen suspect. They argue that Hauptmann, a recent immigrant with a criminal past, was the perfect scapegoat. His possession of the ransom money, this theory posits, was indeed Fish's fault, and the police simply planted the crucial wood evidence in his attic to secure a conviction. The sensational nature of the trial, the relentless media coverage, and the public hysteria is seen as proof that the court was more interested in a public execution than in due process. Hauptmann's defiant final statement from the electric chair is the cornerstone of this theory. The accidental death cover-up. Finally, there is the belief that the child died before the kidnapping and that the whole ransom scheme was a cover-up for an accidental death on the estate. This is the darkest theory, suggesting the baby was killed accidentally by a staff member or even a parent, and a criminal plot was created to hide the truth. However, the discovery of the child miles away from the home and the continued pursuit of the ransom notes makes this theory harder to sustain. Yet it remains part of the case's gruesome lore. The Gaston Means hoax, a conman's game. Beyond the internal mysteries, one bizarre side plot suggests the entire ransom period was corrupted by organized crime and con men. Gaston Means, a disgraced former FBI agent and notorious con artist, convinced a wealthy heiress, Evelyn Walsh McLean, that he was negotiating directly with the real kidnappers on her behalf. Means managed to swindle McLean out of $100,000 by promising to secure the child's return. While Means was later convicted of larceny for this fraud, his involvement added a thick layer of political intrigue and backroom dealing to the chaotic investigation, highlighting how easily desperate people like the Lindberghs were preyed upon by criminals using the tragedy for profit. This theory posits that the case was simply too big for a lone carpenter, and organized players were operating in the shadows. These unresolved questions, the flimsy ladder, the shaky alibis of the household staff, the questionable planting of evidence, and Hauptmann's defiant final statement all converge to ensure that the Lindbergh kidnapping remains the greatest unsolved true crime puzzle of the 20th century.
And that brings us to the end of the line on the Lindbergh legacy. It's a chilling case where justice felt like a necessity, even if the truth remained murky. We invite you to share your thoughts on the enduring doubt. Do you believe Bruno Hauptmann was telling the truth, that he was only guilty of hoarding the ransom money, and that the real killer or an accomplice walked free? Did the American legal system execute a thief to close the book on the most infamous murder of the 1930s? Let us know what you think in the comments below. You've been listening to Mythos and Murder Manor, where every tale hides a truth, and every truth hides a shadow.